Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Hedegaard. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, this afternoon revealed his third budget outlining the government's fiscal policies for 2012. With many of the budget's details already released to the public, there has been some criticism. The Liberal Democrats want the changes introduced sooner, while Labour wants to see the budget tackling other areas in a bid to prevent Britain slipping into a double-dip recession. To continue the debate, I'm joined in the studio by Robert Oxley, Campaign Manager for the Taxpayers Alliance, Gavin Hayes, General Secretary of Compass, Philip Booth, Editorial and Programme Director at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and on the line we have Lauren Thorpe, Research and Corporate Partnership Director at Reform, and Dr. Stephen Barber, Senior Lecturer in Management at London South Bank University. Robert, if I could start with you, this budget's thrown up a few surprises, hasn't it?
Well, I'd say that motorists themselves, they won't be too impressed at the fact that they won't be seeing any relief in the budget for fuel duty. Motorists already face excessive taxes, and the fact is, for many people, the car isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. So I think that, there will be some people who were hoping to get to see a little bit of ease in this budget, haven't seen it today.
Well, look, I think the key fundamental question that you have to ask about this budget is, does this budget help, the hard-working bottom 99%, or, does it help the top, the wealthiest 1%? And I think clearly with the action that we've seen with this budget in terms of the top rate of tax being reduced from 50p to 45p, that clearly this is a budget that has helped the top 1% at the expense of the bottom 99%. And I think that is the fundamental issue here.
And that's something Ed Miliband raised in his comments immediately after the budget, that the change in the tax will only affect 99%. Do you agree with Labour's case on this?
No, I don't. I mean, unless you don't actually accept the OBR's report and the Treasury's report into the impact of the 50p tax rate, then I don't think there's any case for saying that whatsoever, because clearly the impact of the 50p tax rate appears to be that it chokes off enterprise to a sufficient extent that it hardly raises any money at all. And indeed, the taxes which the Chancellor of the Exchequer is imposing on the rich, such as additional stamp duty and clamping down on stamp duty avoidance, I would certainly disapprove strongly of the additional stamp duty. They will raise about 5 times as much from the rich as the 50p tax rate.
But look, I mean, one should argue that the Chancellor should have taken that action in any case to clamp down on tax evasion. There was speculation before this budget of a tycoon tax. We heard absolutely nothing about that in the Chancellor's statement. And as we know, with any tax changes, they take time to take effect. Well, and so therefore I think that there is a strong moral argument, given the fact that we are faced with a financial crisis and tough economic times that were caused in part by the excesses of those at the top. This is right that they pay their fair share to society for a crisis that they in part caused as a result of the banking crisis, and therefore I think that there is a strong moral argument that those at the top should pay more.
Stephen, you wanted to come in there at that point, I think.
Well, I just wanted to point out that there was a nod towards, if not quite the tycoon tax, but there was this cap on tax relief at 25% of income for those, I think it was over £50,000. And the Chancellor making the point that it was the same as capping benefits. Of course, it's not quite the same as capping benefits, but there was a nod towards that. So it would be wrong to suggest that there's nothing at all to prevent the very, very wealthy from taking advantage of tax loopholes.
I think the idea of scrapping a tax which is damaging the economy is somehow hurting the poor is quite frankly ridiculous. And let's not forget, at the same time as we've seen the top rate reduced, although clearly not far enough, we've also seen a huge increase in the personal allowance. And that's going to benefit every taxpayer, whether they're earning £10,000 or £50,000. And that's the most important part of the budget, is the fact that it's going to make work pay. We have a system where we need to take those who are on minimum wage out of tax, because it's ridiculous to take more money out of their pockets in tax and then hand it back to them in tax credits. And to go back to the 50p rate, the fact is that Treasury figures and the OBR figures were showing that the 50p rate of tax wasn't raising the income that it was predicted to. It was quite clearly a political trap which was set by the previous government for the current administration, and it was acting as a big sign saying Britain wasn't open for business and wasn't open for growth. So I think that yes, that there has obviously been a tax cut for the rich. But the fact is, this measure will bring in more money for the economy, and at the same time, those who are the poorest, they're facing a much larger personal allowance, which will help them in the long run.
I think also with regard to the tycoon tax, I mean, the reason there was a good reason why that wasn't brought in. It was an idea which Nick Clegg seemed to drop into a speech from nowhere, and it was very rapidly, roundly criticised by even the most left-wing elements of his own party, such as Lord Oakeshott. And the analogy which Nick Clegg, I think, drew with the sort of minimum tax rate that exists in the United States is completely invalid. They have a completely different way of assessing tax, which essentially makes the tycoon tax irrelevant in the UK. I'm slightly concerned, I must say, about this cap on tax relief. I can certainly understand why the Chancellor, any Chancellor, would want to have a cap on the amount of tax relief that is used for pension contributions. That's a loophole that can clearly be exploited to a greater extent than is really intended by the purpose of the loophole. But it seems to me that this generalised cap on tax relief, the main effect will actually be felt on charitable giving by the well-off, and I wouldn't have thought that's something one wants to, in any sense, discourage at all.
And just a reminder, you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London, and today we're discussing the budget. And in the studio we have Robert Oxley from the Taxpayers Alliance, Gavin Hayes from Compass, Philip Booth from the Institute of Economic Affairs, and on the line we have Lauren Thorpe from Reform and Dr. Stephen Barber from London's South Bank University.
I think another measure that we've got to look at is, well, it is good news for some people. You know, smokers certainly won't be thanking the Chancellor this evening, because at 6 o'clock they'll be seeing a 5% above inflation rise in the packet of cigarettes. That's about 37p on a packet of cigarettes. And we've seen this in budget after budget. They're an easy target, and it's become increasingly more expensive for what for many people is one of life's little pleasures.
And on average, they're not very well off either.
It's interesting to me here, I mean, listening to this debate that we're involved in, and of course, so Ed Miliband's response, that clearly the politics of this whole budget is around that 50p rate. But actually what's surprising about the budget is not just the budget that is announced, but also really how it's framed. I mean, I think this is really quite an ambitious budget, given that the Chancellor himself had tied his own hands with that very first budget and the comprehensive spending review, where he set out for the whole of the Parliament exactly what it was that he wanted to achieve in terms of the fiscal position. And given that, actually he's been fairly creative in setting out a potentially quite a significant budget in terms of what he's trying to achieve in terms of technology, the tax system, and these sorts of things, given that overall, it has to be noted, and I think we should say this is a fiscally neutral budget. He's not raising any more, and he's not spending any more.
I actually thought what Robert said, in fact, quite interestingly, perhaps, was what Robert had to say actually about help for motorists in terms of fuel duty. Because, of course, the interesting thing was that in George Osborne's last budget a year ago, he did, in fact, announce a new levy on North Sea oil companies to help motorists with their fuel duty. One of the measures that we would have liked to have seen is actually a new levy actually on energy companies to help people in fuel poverty, because we've had huge increases in the cost of energy in this country over recent years, and one measure that George Osborne could have pursued is imposing an additional levy on the energy companies to help people with their energy bills. Another idea that we would have liked to have seen George Osborne pursue as well is, of course, this idea of a financial transactions tax. A tax on a very small tax on financial transactions to help those at the bottom. But I would just reaffirm my point earlier about in terms of this budget, and that is the key test of this budget. Will it ensure that those at the bottom are helped, or will it simply help the top 1%? And I think it's clear, given the huge slashing in the top rate of tax, that it will help the top 1% at the expense of the bottom 99%.
But if the top rate of tax is being slashed, the rate of tax is being slashed, but that rate itself only brings in £100 million, I think the estimate was, then it doesn't help the poor in any respect whatsoever. And indeed, because of the enterprise that is choked off in the course of reducing what these people were earning and what the Treasury thought was initially taxable of about £12 billion down to a few £100 million, actually that is damaging for the poor. I could talk all day about the financial transactions tax, but I'll save your listeners that for the moment, given it wasn't a measure that was even discussed in the budget, and just perhaps comment on this levy on energy companies that you suggest. I think that is an idea which indicates the problems that politicians get into when they look at the first round seen effects of a policy and therefore go for a gimmick which will perhaps harm energy companies, which everybody thinks are run by big fat cats and all the rest of it. But what are the unseen effects of that? Energy companies' prices are regulated on the whole, and they are set in accordance with the profit margins or set with a view to the profit margins and return on capital that they can make. If you charge them a levy, then in the end, the prices that energy companies are going to be allowed to charge will increase. Not only that, if you actually reduce their profits, you'll reduce their return on capital, you'll reduce the much needed investment that we need flooding into the industry over the next 25 years. And of course, you'll reduce the returns that pensioners, savers and so on receive on their investments. And these people are really struggling as annuity rates and so on plummet. The unseen effects of these kinds of levies can be enormous.
But, sorry, I was just going to say that as we've seen on the levy in terms of North Sea oil companies, as George Osborne actually made the case, these companies make their investment plans years into the future. As long as the levy is reasonable, as long as it's focused on the excessive profit that is being made, it doesn't need to have those negative effects that you just described. And if I could very quickly come back again on this issue of the top rate of tax, the solution to making the wealthiest in society pay their fair share, is not to slash the top rate. It's to ensure that we've got, professional tax collectors, if necessary, employ more tax collectors at HMRC to ensure that the taxes are collected, and to ensure that we have a more stringent regulatory tax framework to ensure that people can't avoid paying their tax in the way that they have been.
But ultimately, tax collectors can't stop someone from leaving the country. The fact is that the top rate of tax, people will avoid it no matter what, especially when we have a tax system which is overly complicated, it's not simplistic and it's not fair. So the simple fact is that to talk about the fact that by cutting the 50p rate you're harming the poor while ignoring what's being done at the bottom level and with the personal allowance, I think that's disingenuous. But here's what we can see from these proposals is more likely they are going to bring more money into the economy. Now that benefits everybody. But you're right to point out about the energy bills, and I think that we didn't see anything in the budget to even mention the fact of rising costs of energy. And polling has shown that the average family, their biggest priority at the moment is household energy bills. But then I think also, if you're going to get into that debate, you've got to look at what the government are actually doing to put energy bills up. The fact is, City analysis has suggested that government policies at the moment will add on 40% to the average household energy bill because of the renewable targets that we're trying to pursue and the way that we're doing that.
And I would just sort of add on to that is that I found it quite remarkable that there didn't appear to be absolutely any contingency planning in the budget to sort of deal with any potential problems in the Eurozone. Because if we do have problems in the Eurozone, in the year ahead, that could have a huge impact on the UK economy. I found it quite concerning, actually, that there doesn't appear to be any contingency planning in terms of that. Well, I would have liked to have, I would have liked to have heard something from the Chancellor in terms of, money that's being put aside to sort of, deal with any potential future financial crisis.
Well, there is a contingency fund that exists, and there is a great deal of planning also which is going on within the Bank of England to deal with what might be the fallout of the Eurozone for the banking system as a whole. And I'm just not sure necessarily that this is an issue for the budget as such. But just getting back to energy prices, now I think the point that's just been made is correct. Not only is the government loading these green measures onto the economy, but it's going about loading these green measures in an extraordinarily efficient way. Energy prices aren't going up because the energy companies are profiteering. The energy prices are going up because the wholesale price of gas and oil is rising, and because they're having obligations loaded upon them by the government. And this is not only deeply damaging to the economy, it's particularly damaging to those parts of the economy outside the government sector and the manufacturing sector in particular, which George Osborne seems to want to encourage.
And just a reminder, you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London, and today we're discussing the budget. And in the studio we have Robert Oxley from the Taxpayers Alliance, Gavin Hayes from Compass, Philip Booth from the Institute of Economic Affairs, and on the line we have Lauren Thorpe from Reform and Dr. Stephen Barber from London's South Bank University.
I think it's interesting that the debate that has been so focused and admittedly trailed so much in the media is focused on the just the top rate of tax, because it is the political football at the moment. And obviously I feel that the Chancellor hasn't gone far enough by only reducing it to 45p. But there have been other measures, like what we should also talk about is the tax and spending statement that every taxpayer is going to get from 2014. Now this was a backbench Conservative MP's motion only a couple of months ago, and suddenly now this is government policy, and we supported it at the time because it will let every taxpayer see how much they're actually paying and where that money is being spent. And I think that will make our politicians more accountable, because when they go knocking on the door and asking for the votes, they will simply, they can hold up that statement and say, well, why are you spending money on this? Why are you taking that much of my revenue? Why aren't I getting good value for money when I do visit the NHS? So I think there's, this statement will certainly empower people in looking at future budgets and how their money is spent and collected by the government.
We haven't heard much from Lauren yet. I was wondering if she might come in at this point.
Yes, I mean, I think that the personal tax statement idea is fundamentally a good one. But, like a few of the things in this budget, it's just another gimmick. It's going to be very difficult to implement, and it's not going to be particularly accurate. It's not going to include indirect taxes. What are they going to do about employer national insurance contributions, which, of course, is another form of taxation? But I think more importantly, it doesn't address the key problem here, which is the deficit problem.
I think you're completely right to address the fact that it's not going to include things like VAT, corporation tax, the effect of employers' national insurance. That doesn't make it a gimmick. It's an important fact that most people don't even realise what the basic rate of tax that they pay. They don't see that they're paying 32 pence rather than just 20 pence, because when you combine national insurance and income tax. And so I think it's important that we do have tax transparency, because that will certainly make politicians more accountable, and it also make us see where our money goes. And some people have tried to argue that we have to trick people into paying their tax money, because if they knew where it was being spent, that we wouldn't actually agree to it. Well, I think that's not the answer. We have to trust the people, and when people do see how their money's being spent, and when they do see it in places where they're getting really good value from public services, they'll be supportive of that.
I must admit, I agree with Laura entirely here. Although it's a good idea in theory, I think its implementation could be disastrous in practice. What taxpayers are going to see is a whole load of items which the government is spending money on, which is supposed to benefit them, and they're going to see maybe 35, 40, perhaps 50% in some cases of the taxes which are used to finance those items. And they'll look at that and think, wow, that's good value for money. Yet all the other taxes that they pay, including the green levies that we've just been talking about, are just hidden under the carpet and swept under the carpet, and taxpayers don't notice those at all. Yeah. I think it could do a great deal of damage, actually, for those of us who believe in small government.
And I think this is the reason that governments haven't done it in the past. I mean, this is a proposal that gets raised every now and again. It's one of those, the risk that people say, well, I simply don't want to pay for that item there or this item here. I suspect the reason that the government wants to do this time is that it will show how much interest we're paying as a country, and that's the item that the government really wants to communicate.
But on that point, and on all the points that have been made, I think it's important that any annual statement is viewed with the utmost of integrity in terms of how it is produced, and therefore I think that there is a strong case for saying that these annual statements, perhaps this is a job actually for the National Audit Office, and that these statements shouldn't just simply be viewed as some sort of piece of sort of political propaganda, if you like, for the government. People need to have confidence in the figures that statement contains, and so I think that is a very important aspect.
And it's very difficult to have confidence, of course, in the way that government conducts its accounting, given the, almost frauds when you compare the system of accounting with the private sector that are undertaken by the government. And we saw another big one of those today, in that the Royal Mail Pension Fund, £28 billion of it, is going to be effectively nationalised, used to pay off the debt and all the liabilities of that fund are going to be imposed as a burden on future taxpayers going forward. So we think that the national debt is actually £28 billion lower, whereas the government is actually taking upon itself a commitment to pay the pensions of all the current Royal Mail workers, a burden which will fall on future generations, and now there's no fund to actually pay those pensions.
Just in our final couple of minutes, we can move on to this broader picture of what this budget could mean for the British economy. The Chancellor predicts that inflation and employment will fall by next year, and borrowing will also fall from 126 billion to 120. Do you agree with those predictions? Do you think we're moving in the right direction? And do you think there'll be visible improvements based on George Osborne's third budget?
I think that what you can say is that there are measures in here that will be welcomed and will help the economy. But I think the government at the moment isn't going far enough in certain measures to really kickstart growth. And the fact is that businesses are still strangled by red tape. Taxpayers still don't see how much money they are actually paying in tax. And the fact is that we still have too much burdensome regulation and an excessive burden of taxation to seal real economic growth at a time when the economy is sluggish. And as I said, we have the Eurozone crisis and global economic sluggishness to deal with.
And that's something George Osborne did stress, that Britain's economic future is very much tied to the Eurozone. But do you agree that things will improve?
I'm not sure that things will improve greatly. We're dealing with a very topsy-turvy economy. We're not actually sure, how much it is indeed going to grow, whether it's going to grow at all, in fact. And the government doesn't seem to have a plan B for the economy. And as I say, the key test for me is, does this budget stop the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer? And I don't think that will happen. I think in years to come, we'll have a Britain that's even more divided, where, the inequality gap is even bigger. This budget is going to do nothing to stop that.
Their hope is that actually we'll have a much stronger 2012 than is being predicted at the moment. And I think that's probably where Osborne's positioning himself, hoping that 0.8% is actually going to be closer to 1 and perhaps above 1.
And Lauren, I heard you wanted to come in at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think just something that we need to be very wary of is that the government's starting to develop a reputation now for making policy decisions on the hoof in some sort of, tug of war between the coalition partners. The reform of the child benefit system is an example of that. We've seen the goalpost being moved on achieving the fiscal targets, with the budget now being balanced from 2016-17 rather than 2014-15, which was announced in the autumn statement. The public sector net debt figure is still in the danger zone. They've risen that number twice in the past 12 months. So I think, the budget today, it's going to look very good in the next 24 hours of the media cycle, but it's not really addressing the fiscal challenges that this country faces. We're spending more money than we're collecting, and until spending falls, the focus should be on creating a broad and stable tax base that can sustain the spending that we're doing.
He made a very interesting critique, I think, partway through there. We critiqued this, what he called the illusion of cheap finance, and I think that in part goes to Lauren's point that what we're seeing is a significant shift in Europe, in the United States, and here in Britain towards balanced budgets. And I think this is a public policy shift over what we'll see having significance over a long period of time.
Yeah, I think the point that Laura has just made about making policy on the hoof is very important. The child benefit decision was a complete shambles, and the resolution of that is now to have two completely independent, means-tested systems of providing child support for parents, neither of which interact with each other. Secondly, we've got this system now of government guaranteed and subsidised loans to small businesses, at the same time with the position of the FSA, which is tying banks up in knots to stop them lending to small businesses without holding a lot more capital. Then thirdly, you've got things like the government promising not to build a third terminal at Heathrow whilst wanting to promote rapid expansion of infrastructure. And I think these are problems which are inherent within the coalition, but also problems within the Conservative Party itself. But to sum up, quite frankly, I want a budget which makes the poor richer, and I'm very content if the rich get richer too, and I don't think there's any contradiction between that. But we can't do that when the state is spending 50% of national income and taxing over 40% of national income, with some very heavy headwinds ahead in terms of burdens arising from increased health service costs, pensions costs, and so on.
And with that, we'll have to bring today's discussion to a close. And may I thank all my guests: Robert Oxley from the Taxpayers Alliance, Gavin Hayes from Compass, Philip Booth from the Institute of Economic Affairs, and on the line, Lauren Thorpe from Reform and Dr. Stephen Barber from London South Bank University. You've been listening to The Voice of Russia in London. Stay with us, we'll be back after the news. The change in the tax will only affect 99%. Do you agree with Labour's case on this?
No, I don't. I mean, unless you don't actually accept the OBR's report and the Treasury's report into the impact of the 50p tax rate, then I don't think there's any case for saying that whatsoever, because clearly the impact of the 50p tax rate appears to be that it chokes off enterprise to a sufficient extent that it hardly raises any money at all. And indeed, the taxes which the Chancellor of the Exchequer is imposing on the rich, such as additional stamp duty and clamping down on stamp duty avoidance, I'd certainly disapprove strongly of the additional stamp duty. They will raise about 5 times as much from the rich as the 50p tax rate.
But look, I mean, one should argue that the Chancellor should have taken that action in any case to clamp down on tax evasion. There was speculation.
There was this cap on tax relief at 25% of income for those, I think it was over £50,000. And the Chancellor making the point that it was the same as capping benefits. Of course, it's not quite the same as capping benefits, but there was a nod towards that. So it would be wrong to suggest that there's nothing at all to prevent the very, very wealthy from taking advantage of tax loopholes.
I think the idea of scrapping a tax which is damaging the economy is somehow hurting the poor is quite frankly ridiculous. And let's not forget, at the same time as we've seen the top rate reduced, although clearly not far enough, we've also seen a huge increase in the personal allowance. And that's going to benefit every taxpayer, whether they're earning £10,000 or £50,000. And that's the most important part of the budget, is the fact that it's going to make work pay. We have a system where we need to take those who are on minimum wage out of tax, because it's ridiculous to take
Rises, hasn't it?
Well, I'd say that motorists themselves, they won't be too impressed at the fact that they won't be seeing any relief in the budget for fuel duty. Motorists already face excessive taxes, and the fact is, for many people, the car isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. So I think that there will be some people who were hoping to get to see a little bit of ease in this budget, haven't seen it today.
Well, look, I think the key fundamental question that you have to ask about this budget is, does this budget help, the hard-working bottom 99%, or, does it help the top, the wealthiest 1%? And I think clearly, with the action that we've seen with this budget in terms of the top rate of tax being reduced from 50p to 45p, that clearly this is a budget that has helped the top 1% at the expense of the bottom 99%. And I think that is the fundamental issue here.
And that's something Ed Miliband raised in his comments immediately after the budget.
Before this budget of a tycoon tax, we heard absolutely nothing about that in the Chancellor's statement. And as we know, with any tax changes, they take time, to take effect. And so therefore, I think that there is a strong moral argument, given the fact that we are faced with a financial crisis in tough economic times that were caused in part by the excesses of those at the top. This is right, that they pay their fair share to society for a crisis that they in part caused as a result of the banking crisis. And therefore, I think that there is a strong moral argument that those at the top should pay more.
Stephen, you wanted to come in there at that point, I think.
Well, I just wanted to point out that there was a nod towards, if not quite the tycoon tax, but there was.
Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Hedegaard. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, this afternoon revealed his third budget outlining the government's fiscal policies for 2012. With many of the budget's details already released to the public, there has been some criticism. The Liberal Democrats want the changes introduced sooner, while Labour wants to see the budget tackling other areas in a bid to prevent Britain slipping into a double-dip recession. To continue the debate, I'm joined in the studio by Robert Oxley, Campaign Manager for the Taxpayers Alliance, Gavin Hayes, General Secretary of Compass, Philip Booth, Editorial and Programme Director, the Institute of Economic Affairs, and on the line we have Lauren Thorpe, Research and Corporate Partnership Director at Reform, and Dr. Stephen Barber, Senior Lecturer in Management at London South Bank University. Robert, if I could start with you, this budget's thrown up a few surprises.